Leviticus, I've been a believer since I was 8. And I've tried to read the Bible seriously most of that time. Leviticus is a book that I would either hurry through or sometimes skip. And my reasoning was, I don't have to know about all that Jewish stuff that was nailed to the cross. All of you know this story, this reasoning. My core conviction now is that it is impossible to understand the life and the ministry and the death and the resurrection of Messiah without understanding the Levitical sacrificial system. And we're partway through chapter 6, and we will finish 6 and get into 7 today. But let me pick up a good place. We're going to read at least part of 6. All right. Let's pick up. Even though it's the end sentence of a paragraph. Someone read 18 through 23. Anybody from whatever translation you like to read from. And 19 through 23 is a paragraph, but I do want to have verse 18 included in this. 18 through 23. You going to read that, Susan?
I got it.
Okay.
Any male descendant of Aaron may eat of his share of the offering made to the Lord by fire, and this will be continued from now on. Rather, touches of those offerings shall become holy. The Lord said to Moses, this is of the offering Aaron and the priest must bring to the Lord on the day of appointment. Aaron as the priest, they must bring 2 quarts of fine flour for a continued grain offering, half of it in the morning and half in the evening. The fine flour must be mixed with oil and cooked on a griddle. Bring it when it is well mixed. Present the grain offering that is broken into pieces, and it will be a small smell that is pleasing to the Lord. One of the priests appointed to take Aaron's place as the high priest must take the grain offering. It is a rule forever that the grain offering must be completely burned to the Lord. Every grain offering made by a priest must be completely burned. It must not be eaten.
Thank you, dear. And that's 24 through 30. And we'll read the whole chapter 7 in a minute, but let's just finish up 6.
And Jehovah spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, this is the Torah of the sin offering. In the place where the ascending offering is slain, the sin offering is slain before Jehovah. It is most set apart. The priest who is making atonement eats it. In the set apart place it is eaten in the courtyard of the tent of appointment. All that touches its flesh is to be set apart. And when its blood is sprinkled on any garment, you wash that on which it was sprinkled in a set apart place. Is that 2 words?
Yeah.
That's it.
Oh.
That's it.
All the way to
30. Oh. But the earthen can't speak today. But the earthen vessel in which it is cooked is to be broken. And if it is cooked in a bronze pot, then it is scoured, rinsed in water. Every male among the priests eats it. It is most set apart. And no sin offering from which any of the blood is brought into the tent of appointment to make atonement in the set apart place is eaten. It is burned with fire.
Okay, thank you, all of you who've read. And I want to reread the last sentence of verse 18. And I realize in chapter 6, there's some variation in verse numbers, depending on whether you have an English translation that originated with the Textus Receptus, as opposed to one that originated with the Hebrew Tanakh. And we'll try to make allowances for those. But that last sentence in verse 18 in the ESV says, whatever touches them shall become holy. We want to review just a little bit of what we covered at the end of last week.
That's weird. I got a different one than the ESV, and it says the same thing.
Right. Yeah. A lot of the English translations will say something to that effect. Whatever touches them shall become holy. We talked a good bit about this last week. The references to food offerings made to Yahweh, and the meaning of this sentence is not straightforward. I asked the question last week, does that mean that any person who touches this holy portion of food set aside for the priest becomes holy? And I went on to say, well, the other possibility, does it mean that the plate the food from the sacrifice is served on becomes holy? And Tom Bradford really has shaped my thinking on this matter. His Hebrew scholarship credentials are, I think, well established. Many Bible scholars take the position that verse 18 means that anything that comes in contact with holiness becomes holy. But is that the case? Is that what the text is saying here? And I do not believe that is the case. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on this topic. I mentioned last week I don't want to ignore it. Bradford is one of a number of scholars who have doubts about the common translations and meanings of this verse. Now, I spoke last week about the Hebrew scholar Baruch Levine that I encountered during the study. Levine says that we see a pattern in Scripture that is important, and the pattern is that whatever touches anything unclean becomes unclean. But the reverse is not the case. Touching holiness does not necessarily transfer holiness. On the contrary, if something that is not clean or or not in a holy state touches holiness, and possibly a better way to think of that is something not authorized touches holiness, this encounter often results in death and destruction rather than imputed holiness. This is because some element of holiness was contracted by someone or something that was not intended to have it or contact it, and that thing or person, often in the Bible, is destroyed. The pattern is a one-way street. Uncleanness can be transferred via contact to something that is clean, but holiness must not be transferred by contact to something that was unclean or common. Holiness can only be imputed, and we're going to take time to discuss this in just a moment. Only Elohim bestows holiness. Elohim makes the rules as to what is and what can be holy and how holiness can happen. And holiness does not happen by accident. I mentioned we cannot buy holiness and we cannot obtain it by our own will, but we can easily obtain uncleanness by contacting something that is unclean. Even years ago, when I was struggling through Sunday church ministry, I questioned on a number of times and never found any adequate explanation. How is it that Yeshua could touch dead bodies to raise them and not become unclean in the process? Well, he's God. He's Elohim. He can transfer holiness any way and any time that he sees fit. And if you touch a corpse If he touches a corpse and makes it alive again, that's a reverse of this process that we're talking about. That's the exception.
But uncleanness wouldn't be sin.
No,
It's not
no,
always sin.
no.
It's
What-
just a
what-
condition.
What happens in that case, though, being in an unclean state and not taking steps to correct that uncleanness, that
Yeah.
becomes sin.
I think you would have had to do that.
Well, I think you're probably right. We're not told that, but I think he probably had to go through the steps, if for no other
Definitely.
reason
For
than to
example,
demonstrate his obedience to Torah to those who saw him. All right. Bradford and Levine both agree that a better translation of that last sentence, rather than anything that touches these become holy, should likely read, anyone who is to touch these must be in a holy state. We're communicating there. Any thoughts on this?
I wonder if they're talking about character or they're talking about the distinction of being consecrated to a task.
Yeah, see, my understanding, it does involve the consecration or I hate to use the term because it's been misused, but the ritual purity involved in the case. I know that ritual purity is one of the arguments that some of my Sunday church friends use to say we can't be ritually pure, so there's no use fooling with the whole thing. It seems like a silly argument to me, but go ahead.
This transference of holiness to an object, a pan or a clay pot, that's one that's, it's kind of got me baffled.
Yeah, and I'm not going to sit here and claim that I fully understand that.
And not only that, but, that maybe, it can also be taken care of by scouring, by breaking, by washing the clothing. So has the holiness fully transferred to that object? I know that's probably like way deeper than we want to go.
No. That's
It's
an
kind of
excellent,
something that stands out to me as strange.
it's an excellent question, but we need, for perspective, to keep in mind that at the time the tabernacle, and in particular the brazen altar, were dedicated, the utensils and vessels and dishes that
They
were
were
part
already-
of the sacrificial system were also consecrated
Right.
to be made holy. And none of those were clay or earthen vessels. And I'm not 100% sure when sacrificed meat would be cooked in an earthen vessel. I assume it's after the sacrifice was made. The portion that was allowed for the non-priest to eat maybe was sometimes cooked. And we're going to come back to that topic in just a little bit. But the vessels associated with the altar and the sacrificial rituals were bronze or some other hard metal, and some of them may have been silver or gold. I don't recall at the moment. But they could be scoured because they were not porous. Porous vessels would have absorbed some of the broth from the holy sacrifice. Well, I will mention an example that I used last week of how holiness is not transferred by contact, and this is a well-known example. During a particular battle, the Philistines, the Philistine, captured the Ark of the Covenant from Israel in battle, and this did not work out well for them. Thousands died, thousands more were afflicted with tumors, and the statue of their chief mighty one, Dagon, was toppled and set him up, and he fell again and broke into pieces. And then when they eventually were so distressed by being in contact with the holiness of the ark, as they hooked it behind 2 fresh milk cows and sent it on its way, hoping it would go back to where it was supposed to go. And even that took a while. And we know the story of when David was attempting to move the ark to city of David, and they were carrying on a cart rather than by hand with the poles. And a Levite named Uzzah reached out to steady the cart and died because he touched the ark. That all of us have probably seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I'm not sure whether they did a good job of portraying the holiness of the ark or not, but they did to some degree convey the idea that contact with the ark can have horrible consequences.
Yeah.
And at its core, we should remember too that the reason Adam and Hava were banned from the garden after their sin is because the Father walked in the garden and they could not encounter him directly in that holy state. Is this, are we covering this enough? I do want to go on, but I don't want to leave anybody hanging with something you want to say or ask.
Just one more thing.
Sure.
She ended from her translation, but my translation said that the sacrifices to be burned up completely. She said burned by fire, but mine says completely.
Well, we'll cover that as we go on here a little bit. There's some that are, some are not. All right, so my understanding here, and folks, I am always open to better insight, but my understanding is that something which Elohim has not declared holy, when that something or someone contacts something that is holy, usually the contactor is destroyed. Holiness in Scripture is carefully guarded. Only an authorized person who is in a state of holiness is permitted to touch that which is holy. That's Levine's translation of that sentence that's in many of the English translations of verse 18. Only an authorized person who is in a state of holiness is permitted to touch that which is holy. We're going to get to this in chapter 7 also.
Like Moses with his shoes off.
Right. Right.
That's a good example.
We might should have done that song this morning, but I'm not sure what it is about wearing shoes in the presence of holiness is wrong, but I don't have to know what it is. The Father said, take your shoes off, you're on holy ground, Moses. And I imagine
he was grounding himself.
He did that pretty quick. Yes,
So
ma'am.
what about the one, when Yeshua said, be holy as I am holy? So are we holy?
Yeah.
Following?
And that's an admonition from Peter. It's also an admonition from Moses. You shall be holy, for I am holy. So what is holiness? And let's talk about this. We may have various understandings of that. On this side of the cross and the resurrection, what is holiness, and how do we attain that? What you thinking?
It's a set apart.
That you've opened your heart to allow Yeshua to come in, and that means your temple has, and also the Holy Spirit. You've invited them in, and they've made you in some state of holiness.
All right, let's push it just a notch further. What is kadosh? What's the meaning?
Set apart.
Set apart. All right.
For
what are Yeshua's followers set apart? And we could talk all day about this, but let's at least get some semblance.
There's also a little thing of a portion of set apartness. A portion of holiness was given. Like Moses was given a full portion and came back with the Shekinah on him. But also the 70 were given a portion of his spirit. So there must be a full dose and a partial dose.
I think that's a wonderful point. How much holiness can this earthen vessel stand?
And not die.
I'm
In the
not
presence,
sure.
like seeing the face of God, that, you know, you're gonna die.
Well, we've seen a number of scriptural examples of conveying holiness, and one of them is the dramatic event where Eliah, the prophet, is taken up in that chariot of fire, and his successor, Elisha, had prayed to receive a portion.
Double portion.
A double portion of Eliah's spirit, and that the cloak that of Eliah's fell upon him, and that supposedly was some representative of that transference taking place. We are set apart. We are the temple. We possess the indwelling of the Ruach HaKodesh. And yet, I believe, certainly through Paul's teaching, we learn that these bodies, forgiven and set apart though they are, will never be fully set apart until that corruptible has put on incorruptible. So I don't know how much holiness we could stand. I wish that I did. I do know that we could stand more than we generally exercise. So pragmatically, what does that set apart part mean in our day-to-day lives?
We're still attaining to the mark. We're still reaching for the mark.
Yeah.
We're still trying to attain that place of set apart.
And how, what you know, what's the procedure, I guess? And I'm not sitting here saying I've got these easy answers for you. I'm asking opinions and asking.
I suggest it be obedience.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing I come back to again. I'm sorry. Speak up if I don't see you.
I was just gonna say, there's a lot of aspects of set apartness, but the concrete set apartness that we have is to not walk in the ways of the world.
Ding, ding.
Yeah.
We're
Amen.
citizens of another kingdom, not this kingdom.
Correct.
So that sets us apart from the world.
Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. This is at the core. What you said there is what has so moved my wife and me from whatever moment it was less than 6 years ago when we realized we could no longer do the Sunday church thing. Now, do not hear me saying that we think we're better than Sunday Christians now. But do hear me say that our goals, which have always been to I guess, follow God or follow Jesus, were focused in a way that has been remarkably helpful to our daily walk and expression of the faith.
Yes.
And that focus is, here's Torah that tells us exactly how we should be living, and boy, does that make a difference. Now, at the same time, no one who is attempted in the context of, I guess, post-4th century Christianity, no one who has attempted to live in obedience has done so without some consequence. And we can all tell stories about that.
Well, that's because if you're set apart, there's a division. And it scare people, they get defensive, but on the other hand, they notice, and a few will be drawn in by their questions, so.
The Father is in the business of dividing, and
Refining.
pardon?
Refining.
In dividing and refining, I think, refining that which is His. If I can remember to save a little time at the end, I'll read the piece that I'll be submitting on second day to the Blue Ridge Christian News. I'll talk some about that. Okay. We're in a section of scripture here, I mentioned this earlier, where the verse numbers are likely to be different depending on the origin source for whatever translation we're carrying. Make sure I'm not missing something. All right. We read the last part of the chapter, and for some of us that meant starting verse 19, some 13. But either way, we encounter a phrase in what we've read so far. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh spoke to Moshe, saying, "This is the offering that Aaron and his sons shall offer to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh on the day when he is anointed." The word there for offering is korban or korvan. I think it's korban, and I don't fully understand the differences between the B and the V sounds, but korban is a famous phrase from the Gospels. Yeah, anybody remember that word korban showing up in an encounter between Yeshua and the Jewish religious leaders?
Obligation to the Lord, or the obligation to the temple.
I will never forget the first time this was explained to me by Glenn Bourne, who was at that time president of St. Louis Christian College. And I was 19 years old. I've been reading the Bible pretty seriously for more than 11 years, and I had read the passage before. I had no idea what was being discussed. And Glenn said, the summary here is that you could declare all your property korban, which means given to God, and then you're under no obligation in temporal terms, according to their understanding. You're under no obligation to care for your parents. What? How does that work? Who made this up? And of course, it was made up by people who were attempting to guard their possessions from any claim against those possessions. And what Glenn said about korban is you retain everything you owned before, you retain control of everything you owned before. You have a legal loophole for hanging on to it rather than spending any of it to care for your parents. And I could tell even then that someday my parents were going to need care. And what would happen to them if all of their children could say, well, I'd love to help, but all my stuff's tied up. It's invested in this heaven account.
But what a dangerous position to be in, to say that your things are dedicated to Yehovah, and he can sit there and say, so you think they're dedicated to you? Well, let me start subtracting some, or
right,
because of their heart.
Yeah, right.
So korban can mean offering then.
It is. It does mean offering. Yes. But used as it was in first century Judaism, it was an offering that is irrevocable. I've given all my property to God, therefore I can't use it.
Offering on hold.
Yep.
But she already owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. So it's kind of like what are you talking about?
Right. All right, I'm going to push on a little bit. The phrase that used in ESV, this is the offering Aaron and his sons shall offer the Lord on the day he's anointed, can be confusing. It does not mean that the priest will be anointed on multiple occasions. They're only consecrated once. And beginning on that day, they will offer sacrifices every day from then on. The instructions begin by designing a standard, or designating rather, a standard amount of flour to be used for the mincha, which is the grain sacrifice, 1/10 of an ephah, or about 2 quarts. And that's, Susan, what translation are you using? Because that's what it says, about 2 quarts.
NCV.
NCV.
What's that?
I'm not familiar with the NCV.
New Century Version.
New Century.
The New Century.
Okay. It's one I've gotten somewhere.
Okay.
Something.
Well, I noticed as you were reading that it listed the exact figure I've come
It's kind of odd because I'm not used to a lot of stuff that's in this one. I'm like, this is totally different from what I'm used to because King James, even the New English something.
Mine says 2 portions.
I'm usually like, okay, no English, whatever. Today is totally different than what this is, and I'm used to the English today. And
Sure. All right. All right.
King James, or the New King James, because that's the ones I usually read.
Sure. This mincha offering is offered by the priest twice each day. It is a distinct offering, and yet it is part of or an accompaniment to the twice daily olah offering, which is a blood sacrifice. Each morning and each evening, the priest offered a ram. Those offerings were accompanied by a mincha or grain offering each time. And when a mincha offering was brought by a worshiper, and I'm not talking about the 2 that were offered each day on behalf of the nation, when this was brought by an individual worshiper, just a run-of-the-mill Hebrew, a member of the congregation, some of that grain could be eaten by the priest, but the mincha, which was accompanying the twice daily olah, had to be completely burned up. That's what you were picking up there. It had to be completely burned on the altar. The mincha offerings brought by the people could be prepared in a number of ways, but the mincha which accompanied that twice daily olah could only be prepared one way. Some translations say that the flour had to be well soaked, others say well mixed, and that would have been mostly with olive oil and then cooked on a griddle. And then verse 21 or 14, depending on your translation, mentions a pleasing aroma to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. The purpose of burning up things on the altar is to create smoke, and the purpose of the smoke is to create a pleasing aroma for Yehovah. And we've discussed that several times during our study in recent weeks. Then beginning in verse 24 or 17, depending on your translation, we move from the ritual of the mincha to the ritual of the hata'at offering. And we've agreed earlier in our study that we're going to refer to this offering as the purification offering rather than the often used sin offering. And notice that the olah is a blood sacrifice, the mincha is a sacrifice of grain or plant life, and with the hata'at, we're blood sacrifice again. Animals presented for the olah are slaughtered on the north side of the altar, and so that's true with the hata'at blood sacrifice. The priests are to eat of this sacrificial animal under the same rules as the olah offering. Verses 17 through 22 discuss the priest's role in the service of the hata'at. The animal is brought by a lay worshiper, a common man. That's the rules that are discussed in that section. But the situation changes in verse 23, and I'm just going to push through a little bit of this. Stop me if you want to say something. When the hata'at offering is presented on behalf of the priesthood or the entire congregation of Israel, during those special sacrifices, blood from the sacrifice is brought into the sanctuary and sprinkled inside the holy place. And that's the same situation on the most special sacrifice of the year, Yom Kippur, except then this blood is sprinkled inside the Holy of Holies. When a common man brings the hata'at offering, part of the animal is burned and another part is set aside for the priest as food. They can only partake of this meat inside the temple courtyard. Any hata'at offering presented on behalf of the priesthood is considered kodesh kodashim. And we've talked about that. What does that mean? Kodesh kodashim.
Holiest of the holy?
The most
most
holy. Most holy. All of the offering of a kodesh kodashim offering must be burned on the altar. But since the meat from the animal is offered on behalf of a priest, that has to be completely burned, and any blood from the animal that splatters on the priestly garments has to be removed by washing those garments in water. Now, we're going to come back to this business of the clay cooking pot. If any of the meat from the sacrifice is prepared in a clay pot, the pot has to be destroyed. Clay is porous, and it will absorb some of the broth, and this broth is created by most holy offering. So, break the pot. If it's cooked in a metal pot, the pot can be scoured and then rinsed, because they do not absorb the broth. Now, the portion of these offerings that is allowed to be eaten by the priest, only males can eat of this holy portion, and the families of the priest could not eat of this particular meat from the Kodesh Kodashim offerings. Verse 27 of most English translations and verse 20 of the Tanakh-based translations, we again see the statement to the effect, anything that touches its flesh shall become holy, and we've talked about this in great detail. The ESV comes close to this, because the ESV says here, whatever touches its flesh shall be holy. You see how that's a little different? It doesn't say shall become holy, shall be holy, can be translated, shall already have been in a holy state. I'm not sure that's what their intention was, but there is a subtle difference. The issue here, and I don't want to belabor this, but I'll say it one more time, is whether holiness can be transferred by contact, and the clear lesson is uncleanness is transferred by physical contact, but not so holiness. Anything that is to come in contact with these holy offerings shall already have been dedicated to be in a holy state. Garments or cook pots has to already be holy. And I'm through with what I want to say about 6, so I'll stop here and see any questions or discussion you may have. All right, well, let's press on here. Let's just read all of chapter 7. And I'd like for someone to begin by reading 1 through 10. That's a paragraph for most of us English thinkers. I do not think in Hebrew well enough to understand what it is there.
I'll read that.
Oh, please do.
And this is the Torah of the guilt offering. It is most set apart. The guilt offering is slaughtered in the place where they slaughtered the burnt offering, and its blood is sprinkled on the altar all around. Then he brings from it all its fat, the fat tail and the fat that covers the entrails, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the loins, and the appendage on the liver, which he removes with the kidneys. And the priest shall burn them on the altar as an offering made by fire to Yahovah. It is a guilt offering.
Keep going.
Okay. Every male among the priests eats it. It is eaten in the set apart place. It is most set apart. The guilt offering is like the sin offering. There is one Torah for them both, and the priest who makes atonement with it, it is his. And the priest who brings anyone's burnt offering, the skin of the burnt offering which he has brought, is the priest's, it is his. And every grain offering that is baked in the oven, and all that is prepared in the stewing pot or on a griddle, is the priest's who brings it, it is his. And every grain offering mixed with oil or dry is for all the sons of Aaron, for all alike.
Okay, thank you. Now 11 through 18.
Now this is the law of sacrifice of peace offerings, which shall be presented to the Lord. If he offers it by way of thanksgiving, then along with the sacrifice of thanksgiving he shall offer unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers spread with oil, cakes of well-stirred fine flour mixed with oil. With the sacrifice of his peace offerings for the thanksgiving he shall present his offering for the cakes of leavened bread. Of this he shall present one of every offering as a contribution to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest who sprinkles the blood of peace offerings. Now as for the flesh of the sacrifice of his thanksgiving peace offerings, it shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it over until morning. But if the sacrifice of his offering is a vow or voluntary offering, it shall be eaten on the day that he offers the sacrifice, and on the next day what is left of it may be eaten. What is left over from the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day shall be burned with fire. So if any of the flesh of the sacrifice of peace offerings is ever eaten on the third day, he who offers it will not be accepted, and he will not be credited to him. It is to be an unclean thing, and the person who eats it shall bear his punishment.
Thank you. 10 through, 19 through 21. There's my good eyes at work.
Flesh,
Oh, sorry.
flesh that touches any unclean thing shall not be eaten. It shall be burned up with fire. All who are clean may eat flesh, but the person who eats of the flesh of the sacrifice of Yahweh's peace offerings, while an uncleanness is on him, that person shall be cut off from his people. And if anyone touches an unclean thing, whether human uncleanness, or an unclean beast, or any unclean detestable creature, and then eats some flesh from the sacrifice of Yahweh's peace offerings, that person shall be cut off from his people.
Well, just editorial comment, one of the reasons that we are so intently studying the book of Leviticus is to have a better understanding of sin and its consequences. Some of these things here just jump out at me. It's terrifying, and yet I never knew about it until I started studying the book. All right, 22 through 27.
No, I was just gonna add to that, the difference in the state of uncleanness and sin. There's such a distinction.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Where you gonna keep reading?
22 through 27.
Oh, Jehovah said to Moshe, say to the people of Israel, you are not to eat the fat of bulls, sheep, or goats. The fat of animals that die of themselves or are killed by wild animals may be used for any other purpose, but under no circumstances are you to eat it. For whoever eats the fat of animals of the kind used in presenting an offering made by fire to Jehovah will be cut off from his people. You're not to eat any kind of blood, whether from birds or animals or in any of your homes. Whoever eats any blood will be cut off from his people.
All right, I think we'll stop there because I don't think we'll get any farther than that in the study. I mentioned last week and week before last that chapter 6 and 7 form one unit in this instructive process, and the context remains the same. We're now considering instructions to the priests for their role in the asham, or reparation offering. And this is the one that's typically in English translations as guilt offering. A few weeks ago, we discussed the difference between fine or penalty and reparation. And I won't dig too deeply back through that, but I will go with mainly Tom Bradford's understanding on this, that this asham offering is more about reparation or paying back the one who has been offended. And we talked about the monetary value that was added to the sacrificial animal and given to the priest for a number of purposes, and that was because the sin involved was a direct affront to Jehovah's holy property, and we will talk more about that, but not this week. The provision for the Asham offering are identical to those of the Hata'at, and this is explained specifically in verse 7. We see in verse 1 that we're still talking about a Kodeshim class of offering, or most holy offering. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we've talked about these provisions as we discussed the Hata'at. It's another blood sacrifice. The animal slaughtered in the same place as the Olah on the north side of the brazen altar. And another similarity to the Olah is that the internal organ fat is burned up on the altar. And if the sacrifice is a sheep, the fat of the tail must also be burned. This does not apply to goats or bulls or even heifers when it's appropriate to use them. None of the others, because sheep have a particular fat layer associated with the first part of the tail. The portions of meat not burned on the brazen altar were given to the priest as food in the Asham. They were required to eat this food within the tabernacle grounds. That meant in the courtyard, and we discussed it. Typically they would sit just outside the doorway to the holy place. So they're in the courtyard, but they could see into the tent of the tabernacle in a line that runs from their line of sight through the holy place, see the veil separating the Holy of Holies, and if they turn the other way, they're also in a line directly to the brazen altar. Now, we see talk here about the skin of the animal or the hide of the animal, and in that culture, the hide of any animal was valuable. And in this offering, the hide was given to the priest. Let's remember that part of the purpose of Jehovah's sacrificial system was to provide a sustenance, income, food for the priestly class, because they spend their time doing these rituals, and there's no salary for that. And yet there is, because they received part of the meat, part of the grain, and they received all of the hides of the animals that were sacrificed. Beverly and I are in the leather business. We've done that a long time. We did it as a sideline when we were serving churches for a long time. I want to assure you that hides have value. And since 2020, that value has pretty much doubled. I don't know whether they had supply chain interruptions at that time, but leather is expensive.
They had their caravans robbed.
Now, if you're not aware, the raw hide of an animal is not the same thing as leather. It has to be processed in certain ways to convert that animal's skin into leather, but you don't get leather unless you start with the raw hide.
Did they transcribe Torah sometimes onto the leather? I can't remember.
All right, here's what may be in your mind. When Israel had spent hundreds of years in Egypt, and Egypt was blessed with an abundance of a particular reed called papyrus. And when papyrus was processed right, I think it involved beating it and weaving it, but they turned that into paper, and it was good paper. It lasted a long time. Once they left Egypt, they no longer had access to papyrus, so they had to come up with something else to write on. And eventually, they figured out it's beyond tanning of a sheepskin. It's a second or maybe even third layer of processing that results in, the word just ran out of my head.
Melon?
No, what we just call it sheepskin these days.
Parchment.
What?
Parchment?
Parchment
Oh.
is this, in some senses, the best paper available. It has nothing to do with paper. It's a highly refined sheepskin parchment, and the parchment was used to transcribe Torah scrolls. You know, they were, of course, sewn together to make the long roll of, that they could write the entire Torah on, or
I
sometimes.
mean, that would have made it more valuable because how much they valued at having a copy of Torah.
I have seen estimates that I don't recall at all of how large a flock of sheep it took to make one Torah scroll.
Wow.
It was unbelievable
Poor
to
thing.
me.
Yeah.
And remember that livestock is, for most Israelites, their largest asset, or at that time when they were a pastoral people, the value of their herds was pretty much the sum total of their net worth. And I hate that term because it implies that someone is only worth what they own, and we know that's not true. But their possessions were mainly tied up, or their assets were mainly tied up in livestock. And parchment became an important part of that.
So, so I know, I haven't seen a whole lot here lately, but there are books that have like a leathery cover.
Sure. Yeah, and some expensive books are covered, have leather bindings, and certainly a lot of valued books have leather covers added to them. I do make some in my leather shop. I do make some leather Bible covers for people. It ends up being a pretty expensive thing because of the amount of time that is involved. It's not a situation, though, that if you have a fancy leather Bible cover on whatever scripture you're carrying, that does not necessarily mean that you're
Holy.
more holy than others. And some of us grew up in cultures where we understand.
Yeah, I understand that. I've seen some with satanic stuff on them that's been leather too, sticking up here in the store.
Right.
And I'm like, they got this stuff sticking in their windows? Seriously?
There you go. All right, hide was given to the priest. The priest received hides from both the Asham and the Hata'at offerings. In cases when the offering was presented on behalf of a member of the congregation, or if the offering was presented on behalf of the priesthood, the second case, the priest, when the offering, these were presented for the priesthood, the priest did not receive any part of the animal for food. They got the hides, but they did not get any part of the animal for food if that offering was presented on behalf of the priesthood. And the priests were free to sell or barter these hides. Verses 9 and 10 give specific instruction for the mincha offering. Remember, this is a grain offering. If the dough had been cooked, then the priest who presented the offering kept all of the edible portion of that offering for himself. With all other mincha offerings, the edible portion was shared among the priests. You see the difference? If the dough had been cooked in advance, the priest who conducted that offering received all of that one for himself. All the other cases, when the dough had not been cooked in advance, the edible portions were shared among the priesthood. No reason is given for this distinction that I could find. If you know one, I'd be happy to hear it. And no one other than priests were to eat of the mincha offerings. All right. Questions or comments?
Question.
Sure.
So if they offer the animal, so they slaughter it, they kill it, is it gonna stay on the table for certain amount of time before the priest can eat it? Or they can just eat it right away once it's...
Yeah, after that offering is completed, if it includes a portion that is legitimate food for the priest, they can eat of it at any time, but there's a time limit, and we're gonna come to that here in just a moment.
Yeah, I got that, but what is the occasion? It says they have to eat it in the
Courtyard.
outside the whatever, because I was like, well, okay.
It has to do with the level of holiness of the offering.
So I guess that's why some people don't want food brought in, even some, you put nicely, some Sunday people don't even want food brought into the church or anything.
It's a whole different thing. That speaks of an attitude that I grew up with that
That's what I got out of that.
equates meeting houses used by churches with the holiness of the temple or the tabernacle.
Sorry.
What failed? We okay?
That's what I got out of that because of some other stuff.
Right. And we're having a reaction in the other direction now where many of the modern congregations that apparently attracting big numbers they'll have an espresso bar on the way in and serve donuts and just. I'm not commenting on whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's something.
A marketplace too. I mean, that's usually that stuff's for sale.
You said that, I didn't.
That one,
What?
that was when I got out of, well, okay, cause I know there's a lot of places say, well, they don't want food brought in, but does that have anything to do with that or not?
It may have originally in some people's mind. It may have, but.
And I mean, even in Sunday, whatever.
Right. The requirement at that time was for certain offerings, the Kodeshim offerings that included a portion that the priest could eat, they were required to eat that within the tabernacle courtyard. I don't fully understand that rule. It doesn't matter. I don't have to understand it. I just have to do it. And of course, we don't do that because we no longer have a temple or a priesthood in the sense of the Levitical priesthood. But we're studying this to get a better understanding of how important sin is and how radically sin separates us from our holy, holy, holy Father. Let me push on here a little bit. The offerings we've listed so far in chapter 7 are of the Kodeshim class, most holy. Beginning in verse 11, we're going to study a different class of offering, Kodesh Kalim. These offerings are of lesser sanctity. Now, don't hear me wrong. They are still holy, but they're not quite as holy as those of the Kodeshim. The difference is similar to the difference between the holy place inside the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies. They're going through levels of holiness there as you go through the tabernacle. With the Kodesh Kalim offerings, both the worshiper and the priest are permitted to share in some of the meat that is offered. The worshiper must eat outside of the tabernacle, and this may be speaking to what you're talking about, Susan. The worshipers who bring the offering have to take their portion away from the tabernacle to eat it, but the priests are still required to eat their portion inside the tabernacle courtyard. That may be a good place to wrap up here because we're going to hit some ideas next that should be considered in total.
I was just wondering about that because of something that came up in question kind of last week.
Okay.
Most people wouldn't understand it because of normally something that I go to every second Saturday, which I haven't been here lately. I've had a friend from there that's been meeting me, here.
Right.
It's kind of odd because like where they were at, because it got switched to another location, you couldn't have any kind of food in the building or anything like that. And that's not the first time that's been brought up. And I'm like, whoa. Okay, somebody said, well, this person that's over the building, it's normally a person that normally met up, put bluntly, was a person Saturday usually, and they've kind of gone to Sunday. I don't know, I don't really know, but that was said, that's been said more than once, so I'm not sure of this person because I don't know them that well, and that was kind of odd that I was wondering about that.
That's part of the traditions of men, where just like, I was thinking when she was saying that, I was thinking about my old church, don't throw cigarette butts or spit tobacco parking lot because the parking lot's on holy ground. I was like, well, not exactly.
Well, we need to be, I guess,
Only God makes holy.
right. Only God makes holiness. We do not. But we need to be, I think, tolerant of things like this with people who believe differently than we do. There are things that we should never tolerate, and I use as the extreme example, even amongst some Torah believers, you get people who come to the point of saying Yeshua is not divine. I can't go there at all. I have to stop saying you're wrong. But whether or not we're going to have coffee as part of our worship time.
Yeah, I think that's part of approaching with respect.
Right.
It's not necessarily holy ground, but it's, just like he told the priest to wear their underwear, approach with respect, approach me with respect.
Sure.
And that don't necessarily mean that it's holy, but you're approaching with respect.
Right. And I've had this conversation with Scott Ferguson. I had a conversation with Scott Ferguson recently. He and I and a few other people got together to play music here last week on what many call Thursday night. And we had a great time, and after it's over, he had brought along Rosie. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Yes, Rose.
And I invited her to come play music with us sometime as part of our Sabbath worship. Then I looked at Scott and said, now you understand I don't invite you because I know that's not something you would be interested in doing. Because I'm respecting his conviction. I don't agree with his conviction, but that's beside the point.
Right.
In his church tradition, you do not have instrumental music within places of worship. But all of us are inconsistent. I've mentioned a number of times, I grew up in Garden Creek Baptist Church, maybe half a mile from this spot, still in the same place. We were not allowed to dance when I was growing up. It stimulated the lust of the flesh. We didn't dance. But fall of the year, buddy, we had hay rides. And there's some inconsistency there, folks. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Which I noticed at the time, but I didn't complain about. Questions or comments about what we've covered? I know this is technical stuff, and I do not claim to have perfect understanding, but I do think it's important for us to realize what a great gift Yeshua has given us by fulfilling, and not just fulfilling the requirements of Torah, but showing us how to do so perfectly in the way that he lived and making himself an example.
See, that goes back to the same thing again, too, kind of what I was saying, too, because I've always heard, so, well, you're not supposed to have, dancing like in church and stuff. You're not supposed to dance at all once you become a Christian. You're supposed to wear a long dress. You're supposed to, and I'm like, really?
Tradition.
But then I was like, well, some of it I could see, and kind of respect. But then you get to a point, well, if you're a guy, you're supposed to wear this, and I'm like, or it's given over to a reprobate, whatever, and I'm like, well, I guess you're given over to a reprobate mind. Then if you put bluntly that way and you say something about it, you get mad because you're pinching somebody of the same sex gender. I live with somebody who does stuff like that, pinches somebody of the same sex gender on the inappropriately and that kind of stuff. But you have to put up with that in a building where you live, the living situation. But you say something, you get mad, they get mad, and then you get yelled at by the landlord. And I'm like, well, the landlady's like, well, okay, fine, I can talk to them, not to do that kind of stuff around you. Don't talk about it around you, and you don't talk what they said. Well, you're talking about something else that's made them mad, so, and don't talk about that other, religious stuff around them. And I'm like, fine, I was kind of like, whatever, that's what God's word says, but,
Well,
I'll be respectful and not.
Some people don't want to hear God's word.
If each
not
of
talk
us,
on that.
and we've talked about this already today, if each of us will ground ourselves in our best understanding of God's word and live consistently with that, other people will see something odd about us. That will always be the
Set
case.
apart.
Set apart. But odd and set apart are not very different, are they? Go ahead, Polly.
Are we gonna get to verse 23 at some point?
Never, Pollyanna,
But it'd be next
never.
week. You want something you want to say about it?
Well, I'm just interested in, about it saying not to eat fat. Do not eat any fat of bull or sheep or goat.
That's only one for offering,
Is
right?
it 24?
Or is that for outside?
Well, I'll tell you, and we have talked about this some before, my understanding of that is that it refers to this, sometimes called leaf fat, that all mammals at least
24.
have around our internal organs.
Harold calls it a fat jacket.
Right,
Cause he butchered, he
right.
butchered us like a fat jacket.
And that injunction against eating fat does not necessarily include the fat marbling that also comes with muscle tissue. from
Otherwise, how could
clean-
we eat any meat?
Yeah, if we could not eat any fat, we pretty much have to give up meat, and that, we know that that's not the
okay.
case. But the fat there primarily refers to the same fat that will be offered
Right.
during the sacrifice, all this,
Visceral.
yeah, the visceral fat. That's
Because
the
that was considered the best, is why it was offered to Yehovah.
Okay, she's talking about 23. I got that as 25 in mine, so
Okay.
yeah.
If I'm a Levite and know about Yeshua's sacrifice, I will be gladly, I'm glad that sacrifice in the temple is over.
Well,
You know?
we don't know exactly what form sacrifice will take in the millennium, but as I understand, there will be some sacrifice involved there.
I'm glad I'm not a Levite. Or a priest.
So many open-ended ideas are presented in the sacrificial system, but at the same time, there's some specific things we can learn, and one of those is sin is horrible, and we should avoid sin. And this is a radically different attitude from many believers who now have come to believe, well, sin's no big deal, I'm forgiven, I can live any way I want to. That's a dangerous approach.
Yeah, but the reason sin is such a big deal is because it separates us from Yehovah, and the whole sacrificial system was so we could draw near to Him.
Well, and to layer back from that, why were we created in the first place? The best understanding I come up with, He created us to have fellowship with us, and we have interfered with the process.
Yeah.
To His detriment. He suffers in that.